I'm pregnant, and it's not Daniel's, my daughter-in-law whispered. Her voice so soft it barely disturbed the clink of silverware against china, yet somehow it echoed louder than anything I'd ever heard in that dining room. I didn't react. I didn't drop my fork or raise my voice. I simply looked at her, really looked this time, at the calm way she folded her napkin, at the faint curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. The chandelier above us cast a warm glow across the table I had set just an hour earlier, each place carefully arranged the way I had done for decades, out of habit more than hope. Daniel sat across from me, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed somewhere between his plate and the untouched glass of water beside it. He didn't ask her what she meant. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't even look surprised. That was the first thing that told me this wasn't a moment. It was a reveal. I reached for my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth, slow and precise, as if I had all the time in the world. That's quite something to say at dinner, I replied, my voice even, almost gentle, the kind of tone I used when guests overstayed their welcome. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying me, perhaps waiting for something louder, something messier, something she could use. But I had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any accusation. Outside, the evening was settling into that quiet suburban stillness, the kind that makes every small sound inside a house feel amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I noticed details I might have missed on any other night. The way Daniel's hand tightened around his fork, the way Emily's fingers rested lightly over her stomach as if guarding a secret she had already decided to share. You should eat, I said, not to either of them in particular, but to the space between us, to the version of this family that used to exist at this table. No one moved. For a moment, it felt as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see who I would become next. But I already knew. I had been that woman before, the one who absorbed, who adjusted, who kept everything from falling apart. And I had also learned, slowly and quietly, that there comes a time when holding everything together only helps the wrong people stay comfortable. I picked up my fork again and took a small bite, tasting nothing, feeling everything. Across from me, my son finally lifted his eyes, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker there, not guilt, not quite regret, but something weaker. Permission. As if he had already decided that whatever came next was something I would simply have to accept. I set my fork down carefully and met his gaze without a word. In that silence, something shifted. Not in them. In me. Daniel finally cleared his throat, the sound dry and uncertain, as if he had forgotten how to speak in his own home. And when he did, his voice came out softer than I had ever heard it, almost careful, almost rehearsed. Mom, it is not what it sounds like, he said, but he did not look at me when he said it. He looked at Emily, as if waiting for her to guide him, as if the truth itself needed her permission to exist. And that was when I understood something deeper than the words themselves. Something that had been forming quietly long before tonight. Something I had refused to name because naming it would have made it real. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling the familiar would press against my spine, grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still steady, still in control of myself, if nothing else. Then what does it sound like? I asked, not raising my voice, not even adding pressure to the question, just placing it there between us like another piece of silverware on the table. Simple, unavoidable. Emily let out a small breath that could have been a laugh if it had been warmer, but there was no warmth in it. Only calculation. She reached for her glass of water, took a slow sip, and then set it down with deliberate care. It means exactly what I said, she replied, her tone calm, almost conversational, as if we were discussing the weather or a neighbor down the street, and not the quiet unraveling of everything I'd built. I watched her fingers again, the way they rested lightly against the rim of the glass, steady, unshaken. She had practiced this moment. I could see that now. Every movement controlled, every word chosen, even the timing, especially the timing. Daniel shifted in his seat, his chair letting out a faint scrape against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp in the silence. Emily, he said under his breath, but there was no authority in it, only discomfort, The kind that comes when a man realizes he is no longer leading the conversation, only following it. I turned my attention back to my plate, not because I was finished, but because it gave me a moment to think without giving them anything to read. The roasted chicken had gone cold, the vegetables untouched, the meal I'd spent the afternoon preparing now, just another detail in night that would not be remembered for its effort. I picked up my fork again, cutting a small piece, keeping my movements slow, measured. "How far along are you?" I asked, still looking down, as if the answer were simply a matter of fact. Emily did not hesitate. 8 weeks, she said, and for the first time there was something almost like satisfaction in her voice. Not joy, not exactly, but something close to it, something that suggested she had been waiting to say it out loud. I nodded once, absorbing the number, placing it quietly on an internal timeline I had not yet fully drawn. 8 weeks? I repeated it silently, and with it came a series of small memories, moments I had brushed aside at the time, now returning with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Late dinners, unexplained absences, the subtle shift in the way she moved through this house, as if she belonged to something beyond it. Daniel finally looked at me then, really looked, and in his eyes I saw the question he did not dare to ask, not yet, maybe not ever. "What are you going to do?" I met his gaze briefly, then let it pass, because the answer was not for him, not tonight. The clock on the wall ticked once, then again, marking time in a room that no longer felt like mine, and yet in that quiet, in that stillness they mistook for weakness, something inside me settled into place, not broken, not shaken, just decided. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind that feels heavier than any argument ever could. And I found myself noticing things I had not paid attention to before, the way Emily no longer asked if I needed anything, the way Daniel did not reach for the serving dishes unless she moved first. As if the rhythm of this house had quietly shifted without my permission, I stood up before either of them finished eating, gathering plates that were still half full, my movements calm, practiced, the same way I'd cleaned up after countless family dinners over the years. Only now it felt different, not like care, but like closure. "You do not have to do that," Emily said, her voice light, almost polite, but she did not stand to help. She simply watched me, and I nodded slightly without answering, because there was nothing left to explain in simple gestures anymore. In the kitchen, the warm water ran over my hands as I rinsed each plate, the steady sound filling the silence that had followed me from the dining room. I could hear there voices behind me, low, indistinct, a murmur that stopped the moment I shifted my weight or reached for another dish. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I had lived long enough to recognize when conversations were no longer meant for me. When I returned to the table, Daniel was standing near the window, his back to the room, staring out into the dark as if answers might be waiting somewhere beyond the glass. Emily remained seated, her posture relaxed, one hand resting again over her stomach in that same quiet, deliberate way. I took my seat once more, folding my hands in front of me, not as a sign of surrender, but of stillness, of control. "Does he know?" I asked, and this time I looked directly at Daniel, not Emily, because whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion, it had passed through him long before it reached me. He did not turn around right away, and when he did, there was a hesitation in his expression that answered more than his words ever could. "We have talked about it," he said finally, choosing each word carefully, and I noticed he did not say yes. He did not say no. He simply placed the truth somewhere vague enough to stand on without committing to it. Emily exhaled softly, as if relieved that the question had been redirected. "There are things you do not understand," she added, her tone gentle, almost patient, as if she were explaining something complicated to a child. And for a brief moment, I felt the faintest flicker of something old, something familiar, the instinct to defend my place, to remind her whose home this had been long before she ever stepped into it. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something clearer. I rose from my chair again, slower this time, and walked toward the hallway where the soft light from the living room spilled across the floor. I paused just long enough to let the quiet stretch behind me, to let them sit in it without knowing what it meant. Then I reached for my coat hanging on the rack, the fabric cool beneath my fingers, grounding, real. "It is getting late," I said, not looking back at either of them, not asking permission, not offering explanation, just stating a fact the same way I had stated everything else that night. And as I stepped toward the front door, I realized something with a certainty that did not need to be spoken. Whatever this dinner had been meant to do, whatever reaction they had expected, it had not happened, and that, more than anything, had unsettled them. I stepped out into the night air and closed the door behind me with a quiet click. The sound softer than I expected, as if even the house itself had decided not to make a scene. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow across the driveway, and for a moment I stood there without moving, letting the cool air settle against my skin, letting the silence outside replace the tension I had just left behind. It had been years since I had felt this kind of quiet, not the comfortable kind that comes after a long day, but the kind that follows a realization you cannot undo. I walked slowly toward my car, my footsteps steady against the concrete, each one grounding me further in something that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely clear. When I opened the driver's door, I paused again, my hand resting on the frame, because without warning, memories began to surface, not loud or dramatic, but small, precise moments I had overlooked. At the time, Daniel coming home late and brushing off my questions with a quick smile, Emily lingering in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room, subtle shifts that I had dismissed as ordinary changes in a growing family. I had told myself that was what time did, that it rearranged people, softened connections, created distance where there used to be closeness. But now, standing there in the dim light, I saw those moments differently, not as accidents, but as patterns, quiet and deliberate. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the interior of the car wrapping around me in a familiar stillness. And I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I placed both hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead, as if the answer to everything might be waiting just beyond the windshield. 8 weeks, I thought again, letting the number settle more deeply this time, counting back without meaning to, aligning dates, holidays, small gatherings, and with each connection, the picture became clearer, not louder, not more emotional, just clearer, like a fog slowly lifting to reveal something that had been there all along. I remembered one evening in particular, a quiet Sunday not long ago, when Emily had offered to stay behind after dinner to help clean up, insisting that Daniel go home early because he had work the next morning. I had thought it was kind at the time, thoughtful even, the two of us standing side by side at the sink, the warm water running as we talked about nothing important. And yet now, that memory carried a different weight, not because of what was said, but because of what was not, because of the way she had moved through the space as if she belonged to it in a way that extended beyond being a guest, beyond being family by marriage. I exhaled slowly and leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for just a moment, not to escape, but to gather, because there was no confusion left, no lingering question about whether something had been hidden, only the quiet understanding that it had been, and that I had been the last to see it. I opened my eyes again and finally started the engine, the soft hum filling the car, steady and predictable, unlike everything else that night. And as I pulled out of the driveway without looking back at the house, I realized something with a calm certainty that surprised even me. This was not the moment everything fell apart. This was the moment everything became visible. The road ahead was nearly empty as I drove, the streetlights passing one by one in a slow, steady rhythm that gave me time to think without interruption. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to follow the timeline all the way through, not just the fragments that had surfaced in the driveway, but everything, every small detail I had once dismissed as coincidence or imagination. 8 weeks, I repeated again, counting backward more carefully now, placing it against specific days I could remember with uncomfortable clarity. A family barbecue 6 weeks ago, where Emily had insisted on bringing her own dish and spent more time inside than outside. A Sunday morning when Daniel had called to say they would not make it to breakfast because he was feeling unwell, though his voice had sounded perfectly fine. And then there was the business trip he had mentioned 3 months ago, the one that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, with fewer details each time I asked about it. I tightened my grip slightly on the steering wheel, not out of anger, but out of focus because the pattern was no longer forming. It had already formed. I was simply tracing its outline. I turned onto the quiet street where I had lived for over 30 years. The houses familiar, unchanged, a stark contrast to the shift that had taken place inside my own family. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment before turning off the engine, the silence returning once again. Only this time it felt different. Not heavy, not oppressive, but clear, almost deliberate, as if it were giving me space to decide what came next. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, unlocking it with the same key I had used for decades. The small, ordinary action grounding me in a life that had once felt stable and predictable. Inside, the house greeted me with a stillness that was both familiar and revealing. Everything exactly where it should be, every object holding its place without question, unlike the people who had once filled it. I set my purse down on the entry table and moved slowly through the living room, my gaze passing over photographs lined neatly along the shelves, moments captured in time that now felt almost distant. Daniel as a boy, smiling with a kind of openness that no longer existed, holidays where laughter had seemed effortless, gatherings where Emily had stood beside him, her smile warm, her presence easy. I paused in front of one frame in particular, a photo taken not long after their wedding, the three of us standing together in the backyard, sunlight catching in her hair, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, my hand resting lightly on his arm, a picture of something that had felt complete at the time. I reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, though it was already straight, a habit more than a necessity. And, as I lower my hand, I realized that the person in that photograph was not the woman who had sat across from me at dinner, and perhaps she never had been. I moved into the kitchen and turned on the light, the soft glow filling the room, illuminating the same countertops, the same sink, the same quiet order I had maintained for years. And without thinking, I filled a glass of water and took a slow sip, the coolness grounding, steady, real. Then I set the glass down and stood there, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the final piece to settle into place. Because this was no longer about a single moment or a single betrayal. It was about something that had been built carefully, quietly, over time, something that had relied on my trust, my patience, my willingness to believe in the version of family I had always held on to. And as I looked around the kitchen at the life I had created and maintained with my own hands, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided by what they had done, but by what I chose to do with the truth they had revealed that night. I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone, and I did not allow myself the distraction of noise. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the same quiet focus I had carried through the evening, my hands folded loosely in front of me as if I were waiting for something to arrive, but nothing did. Not an apology, not a message, not even the faintest attempt to explain what had been said at that dinner table. And that absence told me more than anything else could have, because people who believe they are right do not rush to explain themselves. They wait for you to adjust, to accept, to fall back into the role they have already assigned you. I glanced at the clock on the wall, watching the minute hand move steadily forward, each second passing without interruption, without hesitation, unlike the people in my life who had learned to pause, to hide, to redirect. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, my steps measured, deliberate, until I reached the small study at the end of the house, a room I had not used much in recent years, not because it had lost its purpose, but because I had in some quiet way stopped needing it. Tonight, that changed. I turned on the lamp, and the soft light revealed the familiar desk, the neatly stacked papers, the drawer that held documents I had not revisited in a long time. I pulled out the chair and sat down, opening the drawer with a calm hand. Inside were folders labeled in my own handwriting, organized, precise, the kind of order that comes from a lifetime of managing not just a home, but everything that sustains it. I took out the folder that contained the property records, the bank statements, the legal documents that defined what belonged to me and what did not, and I placed it on the desk in front of me, not with urgency, not with anger, but with intention, because for the first time, I was not looking at these papers as a responsibility, but as a resource. I opened the folder and began to read, slowly, carefully, letting each line settle into place, confirming what I already knew, but had never needed to question. The house was in my name. The accounts were structured with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. Everything I had built over the years was exactly where it should be, untouched, secure. And as I turned each page, I felt something shift again, not in reaction to them, but in preparation for what would come next, because whatever story they had begun to write without me, it would not end the way they expected. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of it beneath my palm. Steady, real, something I could rely on. Unlike the people who had sat across from me just hours ago, I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a single, quiet breath, not of relief, but of clarity, because the truth had already been revealed, not just about them, but about the space they believed I would occupy in their future. And as I looked around the room, at the life I had organized so carefully, I understood that I was no longer standing inside their version of that future. I was stepping outside of it entirely. And this time, I would be the one deciding what remained and what did not. The house remained quiet long after I closed the folder, a kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but purposeful, as if every object around me was waiting to see what I would do next. And for the first time in a long while, I did not rush to fill that silence with distraction or doubt. Instead, I stood up from the desk and walked back into the living room. My steps steady, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned. I reached for my phone where I had left it on the side table, the screen lighting up in my hand with no missed calls, no messages, no attempt from either of them to reach out. And I was not surprised, because reaching out would have required uncertainty, and they did not feel uncertain. Not yet. I scrolled through my contacts slowly, not searching for comfort, but for clarity, and then I stopped at a name I had not called in some time. Helen Brooks. I let my finger rest there for a moment before pressing call. The line rang twice before she answered, her voice familiar, steady. "Margaret, it has been a while," she said, and I could hear the quiet warmth beneath her words, the kind that does not ask questions before it listens. "It has," I replied, my voice calm, unchanged. "Are you busy tomorrow morning?" There was a brief pause, not of hesitation, but of attention, as if she could sense something beneath the surface of my tone. "No, I am not," she said, more carefully now. "Is everything all right?" I allowed a small breath to pass before answering, not because I needed time to decide, but because I wanted my words to remain exactly as I intended them. "I would like to meet," I said. "There are a few things I need to go over." I did not explain further, and she did not press. That was why I had called her, because she understood that sometimes the absence of details meant the situation was already clear enough. 10 o'clock. She offered. 10 o'clock works, I replied, and we ended the call without anything more, no reassurances, no unnecessary words, just an agreement. I set the phone back down and stood there for a moment, letting that decision settle into place, because it was a decision, not a reaction, not an emotional response to what had happened, but the first step in something deliberate, something controlled. I walked toward the window and looked out into the dark street. The same street I had driven down just an hour earlier, unchanged still, and I realized how easy it would have been to remain in the version of life I had known, to ignore what had been said, to wait for them to explain, to soften it, to reshape it into something easier to accept. But I had seen enough to understand that there would be no honest explanation, only adjustments designed to keep me where I was expected to be, and I was no longer interested in staying there. I turned off the lights one by one as I moved through the house, each room returning to darkness behind me, not as an ending, but as a reset. And when I finally reached my bedroom, I paused at the doorway, taking in the quiet, the stillness, the sense that everything was exactly where it had always been, except for one thing, me. I stepped inside and closed the door gently, knowing that when morning came, I would not be waking up to the same life I'd gone to sleep with, and that was not something to fear. It was something to use. Morning arrived without ceremony, the light filtering through the curtains in. Soft, steady lines that stretched across the floor as if nothing had changed, and I moved through my routine the same way I always had, making coffee, setting a single cup on the table, standing at the kitchen counter while it brewed. But beneath those familiar actions, there was a new kind of awareness, one that sharpened every detail instead of softening it. I noticed how quiet the house truly was, not just in sound, but in presence. No footsteps overhead, no voices in the next room, no sense of being expected anywhere, but exactly where I stood. And for the first time, that absence did not feel like loss. It felt like space. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy coat and low heels, Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested anything other than an ordinary morning, because that was part of it, the calm, the normalcy, the refusal to let what had been said the night before dictate the way I carry myself into the day. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the kind that wakes you fully without asking permission. And I drove to meet Helen with the same steady focus I had held since the night before. No music, no distractions, just the quiet hum of the engine and the clear direction of where I was going. The cafe we had chosen was small, familiar, the kind of place where conversations could remain private without effort. Helen was already there when I arrived. Seated near the window with a cup of coffee in front of her, she looked up as I entered, and in that single glance, I saw that she already understood this was not a casual visit. I sat down across from her and removed my gloves slowly, placing them neatly on the table. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, and she nodded once, her expression attentive, patient. "Of course," she replied. "Tell me what you need." I did not begin with the dinner, not with the words that had been said, because those were only the surface. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed a small stack of documents on the table between us, the folder I had reviewed the night before, organized. "Complete. I want to make some adjustments," I said, my voice even, controlled. Helen glanced down at the papers, then back up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. "What kind of adjustments?" she asked, and I met her gaze directly, holding it just long enough to make the answer clear without raising my voice, the kind that ensure everything stays exactly where it belongs. I replied, and for a brief moment, the corner of her expression shifted, not into surprise, but into recognition. She had seen situations like this before, not identical, but similar enough to understand the direction. "Has something happened?" she asked carefully, and I allowed a small pause before answering. Not because I was uncertain, but because I chose my words with intention. "Something has been clarified," I said, and that was enough. She nodded once more, then opened the folder, her attention moving quickly across the pages, her posture straightening slightly as she processed what she was seeing. "All right," she said after a moment, her tone now more precise, more professional. "We can do that." I sat back in my chair and let her continue, explaining the steps, the timelines, the formalities, each detail falling into place with a kind of order that felt almost reassuring. And as she spoke, I realized that this, not the dinner, not the words, not even the silence that followed. This was where the shift truly began, not in what had been done to me, but in what I was now choosing to do. In return, Helen's pen moved steadily across the margin of the document as she made a small note, then another, her focus sharp in a way that matched my own. And I watched her for a moment without interrupting, because there was something grounding about seeing everything translated into clear steps, into actions that did not depend on emotion or interpretation. "We will need to update the beneficiary structure first," she said, her voice calm, professional. "Then we will revise the property protections and access permissions." I nodded once, absorbing each word not as a suggestion, but as a confirmation of what I had already decided. "How long will it take?" I asked, and she glanced at her watch briefly before answering. "Some of it can begin immediately. The rest will require formal processing, but we can have the core changes in place within a few days." "A few days," I repeated silently, the timeline settling into place with a quiet precision, not rushed, not delayed, just enough time to ensure everything unfolded exactly as intended. I reached for my coffee and took a small sip, the warmth steady in my hands, and for a brief moment, I had allowed myself to observe the scene from a distance. Two women sitting at a small table, discussing documents, adjustments, timelines. Nothing about it would appear unusual to anyone passing by, and that was exactly the point. Nothing about what I was doing needed to be visible yet. "There is one more thing," I said, setting the cup down carefully, and Helen looked up, her expression attentive. "I want to make sure there is no confusion later." I continued, choosing my words. With the same care I had used all morning, everything needs to be documented clearly. No assumptions, no gray areas. She nodded immediately, understanding not just the request, but the reason behind it. "We can make it airtight," she replied, "if that is what you want." I held her gaze for a second, then answered simply, "It is." She closed the folder partway, her fingers resting on the edge as she considered something. Then she leaned back slightly, her tone shifting just enough to acknowledge the weight of what we were discussing. "Margaret," she said, more quietly now, "once this is done, there will be no easy way to reverse it." I did not look away. I did not hesitate, because that was the point. "I am not looking for easy," I said, and the words settled between us without resistance. She gave a small nod, then reopened the folder, moving forward without another question, because there was nothing left to clarify. The decision had already been made. When we finished, I gathered the papers and placed them back into my bag with the same careful movements I had used the night before, each document returning to its place, each step completed without unnecessary motion. We stood at the same time, a quiet synchronization that did not need acknowledgement. "I will begin the process this afternoon," Helen said, and I thank her with a slight nod. Nothing more. Because gratitude did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. Outside, the morning had settled into a calm rhythm, people moving along the sidewalk, cars passing at a steady pace, the world continuing as it always did, unchanged by the decisions being made in quiet corners. I walked to my car and paused before opening the door, not because I was uncertain, but because I was aware that the next time I sat across from them, the balance would already be different, not visibly, not immediately, but in ways they would not recognize until it was too late. I opened the door and got in, placing my bag carefully on the passenger seat, and as I started the engine, I allowed myself one final thought, not of anger, not of regret, but of clarity. They had spoken as if they were introducing a new reality, but what they had actually done was reveal one, and now that I'd seen it fully, I would decide how it ended. By the time I pulled into my driveway again, the sun had shifted higher in the sky, casting sharp, clean light across the front of the house, and I noticed how everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before, the same trimmed hedges, the same quiet street, the same front door I had walked through thousands of times, and yet I stepped out of the car with a different awareness, not of the place itself, but of my position within it. I unlocked the door and entered, setting my bag down, with the same measured care as always. But this time, there was no pause, no lingering uncertainty, only a quiet sequence of decisions already in motion. I moved through the house with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, simply following a path I had already chosen. In the kitchen, I opened a drawer and took out a small notepad, the kind I had used for grocery lists and reminders for years, and I sat down at the table, pen in hand, staring at the blank page for just a moment before beginning to write. Not long sentences, not explanations, just names, dates, and a few key details, things that needed to be confirmed, things that needed to be observed. I wrote down Daniel's recent travel dates, the evenings he had canceled plans, the small inconsistencies I had once ignored, each line placed neatly beneath the last, not out of obsession, but out of clarity, because understanding was not enough. I needed precision. I needed to see the full outline of what had been happening without interruption or assumption. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page, not with emotion, but with recognition. The pattern was complete, not because it had just formed, but because I had finally allowed myself to see it without resistance. I tore the page out carefully and folded it once, placing it inside the folder Helen had reviewed earlier. Then I stood up and walked toward the hallway, stopping briefly at the coat rack where I had left my things the night before, everything still in place, untouched, as if waiting for me to return to the version of myself that had left them there. But I did not. I moved past it and into the living room, where the afternoon light had begun to settle into a softer tone. I reached for my phone again, this time not to call for guidance, but to initiate something specific. I scrolled to Daniel's name and paused, my thumb hovering for just a second before pressing call. The line rang longer than it usually did, and when he answered, his voice carried a careful neutrality. "Mom," he said, as if the word itself needed to be tested before it could settle. "I was going to call you," he added quickly, and I could hear the faint tension beneath the surface. The expectation that I might ask questions, demand explanations, create a scene that would allow him to respond in familiar ways. But I did not give him that. "That will not be necessary," I replied, my tone even controlled. "I would like you and Emily to come over for dinner tomorrow evening." There was a brief silence on the line, not long, but noticeable, the kind that signals a shift in expectation. "Dinner?" he repeated, as if the word itself had changed meaning overnight. "Yes," I said. "Simply 7 o'clock. I did not explain further. I did not offer context or reassurance. I allowed the invitation to stand on its own, complete and without negotiation. "All right," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more uncertain, and I ended the call without adding anything else. I set the phone down and stood there for a moment, the stillness of the house settling around me once again. But this time it felt different, not like a space waiting to be filled, but like a stage, being prepared. And as I looked around at everything I had built, everything I had maintained with quiet consistency over the years, I understood that the next time we sat at that table, the conversation would not belong to them. It would belong to me the next day, moved with a quiet precision that I had not felt in years. Each hour unfolding exactly as I intended, not rushed, not delayed, simply aligned. I spent the morning preparing the house. Not because it needed it, but because I did. The table was set with the same care as always, the same plates, the same silverware, the same arrangement that had once represented routine, but now carried something more deliberate. I cooked as I always had, measured, methodical, allowing the familiar rhythm to anchor me. The scent of dinner filling the house in a way that might have felt comforting on any other day, but now it simply marked the passage of time, a quiet signal that everything was moving forward as planned. By the afternoon, everything was in place. Nothing left to adjust, nothing left to question. I changed into a simple dress, neutral in color, understated. The kind that did not draw attention, but did not diminish presence either. And when I looked at my reflection, I did not search for reassurance. I only confirmed what I already knew. I was ready at exactly 6:50. I turned on the lights in the dining room, the soft glow settling over the table, and I took my seat for a moment, not to wait, but to observe, to see the space as it would appear when they walked in, unchanged, familiar, disarming in its normalcy at 6:58. I heard the car pull into the driveway. The sound distinct, expected. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress with a small, automatic motion, then walked toward the front door, opening it before they had a chance to knock. Daniel stood there first, his posture slightly stiff, his expression composed, but not entirely steady. Emily stood beside him, her face calm, her eyes observant, scanning me in the same way she had the night before, as if measuring what had shifted. "You are right on time," I said, stepping aside to let them in, my tone even, welcoming without warmth. They entered without hesitation, moving through the hallway into the dining room, their steps slower than usual, as if they were aware, even if they could not yet name it, that something was different. I followed them in and took my seat, gesturing lightly toward theirs. "Please," I said, and they sat, the same arrangement as before, the same positions, the same distance between us, but the air carried a different weight, not tense, not loud, just unmistakably changed. I began serving the meal without comment, placing each dish with the same careful attention I had always given, allowing the routine to settle around us like a familiar frame. Daniel reached for his glass of water, his hand pausing briefly before lifting it. Emily adjusted her posture slightly, her gaze moving between me and the table, waiting, always waiting, but I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch, let it settle, until it belonged to me. When everything was served, I finally looked up, meeting their eyes one at a time, not with accusation, not with anger, but with something steadier, something that did not need to be raised to be felt. "I thought it would be best if we all had dinner together again," I said, my voice calm, measured. "There are a few things that need to be made clear," and as the words settled into the space between us, I saw it, the shift, subtle but undeniable. The moment they realized this was not a continuation of a night before, this was something else entirely, something they had not prepared for, and I let that realization sit with them, untouched, because for the first time, I was not reacting to what had been done. I was leading what would happen next. Daniel was the first to speak, though his voice lacked the certainty he usually carried. "Mom, if this is about last night, we can explain," he said, leaning slightly forward as if trying to regain control of something that had already shifted beyond his reach. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my hand or change my expression. I simply let him finish the sentence that he had clearly rehearsed in his mind, because what he believed was an explanation I already understood as a justification, and those were not the same thing. "There is nothing you need to explain to," I said calmly, placing my fork down with quiet precision, the soft sound against the plate marking the end of the meal. Not physically, but symbolically. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, as if she were reassessing the situation, adjusting her expectations. In real time, "Then what is this about?" she asked, her tone composed, but edged with something sharper beneath. I reached beside my chair and picked up the folder I'd placed there earlier, resting it gently on the table between us, not pushing it toward them, not presenting it as evidence, but allowing its presence to speak for itself. "This is about clarity," I said, opening it slowly, the papers inside neatly arranged. Untouched since that morning. Daniel's gaze dropped to the folder then. Back to me. Uncertainty, now more visible, more difficult for him to conceal. "Clarity about what?" he asked, and I met his eyes directly, holding his attention without force. "About what belongs to me," I replied, and for the first time, neither of them spoke. Immediately, the silence that followed was different from before, not passive, not uncertain, but aware. I slid a single document forward, just enough for them to see the header. The legal language clear, unmistakable. "I have made adjustments," I continued, my voice steady, measured. "Everything is now structured in a way that does not rely on assumption or expectation." Emily leaned forward slightly, her eyes scanning the page without touching it, her posture controlled, but I could see the shift, subtle but real. Daniel swallowed once, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the table. "What kind of adjustments?" he asked, his voice quieter now, and I allowed a brief pause before answering. Not for effect, but for accuracy. The kind that ensure there will be no confusion about access, ownership, or decision-making. I said, each word placed carefully, leaving no space for misinterpretation. Emily sat back slowly, her expression no longer curious, but guarded, as if she had finally recognized that this was not a conversation she could redirect. "You are overreacting," she said after a moment, her tone controlled, but firmer now, and I turned my attention to her, not with confrontation, but with clarity. "No," I said simply, "I am responding." The distinction settled between us, sharp and unmistakable. Daniel looked between us, his expression shifting again, searching for something familiar to hold on to, but finding none. "Mom, this is not necessary," he said, and there was the final assumption, the belief that necessity could still be defined by them. I shook my head once slowly. "It already is," I replied, closing the folder. With the same quiet care I had opened it, the sound final, deliberate, and in that moment I saw it clearly, not in their words, but in their silence. They had expected resistance, emotion, something they could push against or explain away, but what I had given them instead was something else entirely, something they could not adjust, could not reshape, could not control. And as I sat there, looking at them across the same table where everything had begun to unravel, I understood that the balance had already shifted, not in a way they could argue with, but in a way they would have to live with for a moment. No one moved, the air in the room settling into a stillness that no longer felt uncertain, but defined, as if something invisible had finally taken its place between us and refused to be ignored. Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass without lifting it, while Emily remained still, her posture composed, but no longer relaxed, the confidence she had carried the night before now replaced with something quieter, more cautious. I did not rush to fill the silence. I allowed it to stretch, to settle, to become something they had to sit with rather than escape from. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the certainty he had tried to hold on to. I considered the question for a brief moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to give it the weight it deserved. "Now," I said calmly, "everything continues." I reached for my glass and took a small sip, setting it back down with the same steady precision. "Just not the way you expected." Emily's gaze sharpened slightly, her eyes studying me as if searching for an opening for something she could still influence. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, her tone measured but firmer now, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "No," I replied. "I am making it clear." The distinction remained solid, unshaken. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling as if the weight of the conversation had finally reached him. "We are still family," he said, the words carrying a quiet plea, not for forgiveness, but for familiarity. And for the first time, I allowed a small pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of honesty. "Family is not a word you use to simplify things," I said, my voice even, not harsh, not raised, just certain. "It is something you protect." The words settled into the space between us, not as an accusation, but as a statement that did not require agreement to be true. Emily looked away first, her attention shifting briefly to the table before returning to me. But the calculation in her expression had changed. She was no longer trying to lead the conversation. She was trying to understand its limits. I closed my hands together lightly in front of me, resting them on the table, a quiet gesture that marked the end of what needed to be said. "Dinner is getting cold," I added, not as a dismissal, but as a return to something simple, something ordinary. And for a moment, neither of them moved, as if unsure whether the conversation had truly ended. But it had, not because everything had been resolved, but because everything had been defined. Daniel reached for his fork again, his movements slower now, more deliberate. Emily followed a moment later, her posture adjusting slightly as she settled back in her chair, but the dynamic had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not through explanation, not through time. I sat there with them, the same table, the same room, the same arrangement, and yet everything was different, not because I had raised my voice or demanded anything, but because I had stepped out of the role they had expected me to play and into one they had not prepared for. And as the quiet rhythm of the meal resumed, I understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. They had thought they were changing my place in their lives, but what they had actually done was reveal theirs and mine, and that was something I would never misunderstand again.